my pleasure to introduce our third panel, the use of force and officer demographics. What do we know about race and gender of an officer impacts use of force? And for this conversation, we have a wonderful panel, a huge panel, and they're going to work it. That we're going to have this rich dialogue, wonderful conversation. They're going to offer us their perspectives, insights, research. And we're going to start with Professor Lisa Avalos. Professor Avalos is an associate professor at Louisiana State University, and her teaching and research interests are in the area of criminal law and procedure, with an emphasis on sexual offenses and gender-based violence. She is also teaching in the area of legal ethics. Professor Avalos' publications have appeared in the Brooklyn Law Review, forthcoming in the Nevada Law Journal, the Michigan Journal of Gender and Law, Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, the Journal of Gender, Race, and Justice, and the Fordham International Law Journal. Professor Avalos previously taught at the University of Arkansas School of Law and was a visiting professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Now, prior to entering academia, she worked as an associate at McDermott, Will, and Emery in New York City and at Neal, Gerber, and Eisenberg in Chicago. She earned her JD from New York University School of Law. She also holds a PhD and an MA in sociology from Northwestern University and a BA in psychology from Northwestern. Prior to attending law school, she taught sociology at Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. Thank you for being here. Amy Dunn Johnson is a family court judge serving the 6th Judicial District. Amy Dunn Johnson is a family court judge serving the 6th Judicial District of Arkansas. She was elected to serve in that role in 2020 and assumed the bench in January of 2021. Her docket includes cases involving divorce, custody, visitation, child support, domestic violence, guardianships, trust in estates, and involuntary commitments. Amy previously served for more than 11 years as executive director, I guess I can take this off for a moment, director of the Arkansas Access to Justice Commission, where she coordinated statewide efforts to ensure civil justice for all Arkansans. She also served as the CEO of the Arkansas Access to Justice Foundation and Arkansas IOTA programs, which engage in resource development and grant-making initiatives to support the objective of increasing access to justice. Her prior time with Arkansas Access to Justice, Amy spent 6 years in private practice in the healthcare regulatory field. In addition to her work in the legal sector, Amy is an advocate for initiatives that promote health and equity. She's a founding member of the Harmony Health Clinic, a free health clinic that serves low-income, uninsured residents of Pulaski County. In 2012, she was one of 10 national recipients of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Community Health Leaders Award. Congratulations. Amy also serves on the University of Arkansas Little Rock William H. Bowen School of Law Racial Disparities Projects Steering Committee and Rural Incubator Project Advisory Committee. Co-research and co-presenting with her is her co-researcher and co-presenting with her is Professor Andre Douglas Palm Cummings, who's the Charles Baum Distinguished Professor of Law. He joined UA Little Rock back in 2018, teaching business organizations, Contracts 1 and Contracts 2, and related courses. Now, prior to arriving at Bowen, Professor Cummings was a visiting law professor at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Law, where he taught contracts, hip-hop, and the American Constitution. Why didn't they have a course like that when I was in law school? Well, hip-hop wasn't really invented when I was in law school. I don't think it existed then. Yeah, it was. It takes a nation of millions. I guess so. What's going on? And he also taught at the, he was a professor of law at West Virginia University College of Law. But before embarking on his academic career, Professor Cummings worked as a judicial law clerk for Chief Judge Joseph W. Hatchett of the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit and for Justice Christine M. Durham of the Utah Supreme Court. Todd Clark, who is joining us virtually, is a professor of law at St. Thomas University College of Law. Prior to becoming a professor there, he was at North Carolina Central University School of Law, where he taught business associations, contracts, corporate justice, employment discrimination, and hip hop law and justice. At NCCU, he also served on the ABA compliance team and was the director of the Justice and Practice of Law Certificate Program and the director of New Initiatives. And before that, still, Professor Clark was a lecturer in law at West Virginia University College of Law, where he taught legal writing and appellate advocacy. He earned his BA in political science from Wittenberg University here in Ohio, his MBA from West Virginia University College of Business and Economics, and his JD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Following graduation from law school, he practiced law at the law firm of Dunn Johnson. His scholarship includes a book, Corporate Justice, as well as numerous law review articles and other scholarship on social justice, corporate discretion, and sexual harassment. He is currently working on a case book in sports law. Mr. Caleb Conrad is an Assistant Attorney General for the state of Arkansas, where his work centers on Section 1983 civil rights litigation and state agency matters before the Arkansas Claims Commission. Prior to his joining the Attorney General's office, Conrad served as a deputy prosecuting attorney for the 11th West Judicial District of Arkansas. Conrad has written several articles on the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and the criminal justice system, progressive prosecution reform, and racial and social justice, having published in the Washburn Law Journal, the St. Thomas Law Review, and the University of Cincinnati Law Review. In September of 2021, Little Rock Mayor Frank Scott Jr. appointed Conrad to a 3-year term to serve on the city's Commission on Children, Youth, and Families, where he currently serves as vice chair and seeks to provide policy leadership and advocacy that improves the health, safety, education, and quality of life of children and their families in Arkansas's capital city. And last but not least, we have Professor Christopher Bayless in the back. Professor Bayless is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Forensic Science at Youngstown State University. His teaching includes and incorporates capital punishment, court processes, law, jury behavior, victimology, and criminology. Some of his most recent work includes the politics and policy of juvenile diversion programs, his book, Guns 360, Differing Perspectives and Common Sense Approaches to Firearms in America, and his article, Racial Variations in Work-Related Stress Among Police Officers. So he's got a lot to talk about too. Please join me in welcoming this panel.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor. And I have my little timer, so in addition to the official time thing, I should be paying attention myself. I just started it running. Okay, thank you all for having me here today, everyone. My topic is called Flying Under the Radar, the Under-Policing of Crimes Against Women of Color. And so I want to start by saying, we've talked a lot about police brutality so far today. And I want to say that when police are busy strangling George Floyd and shooting Tamir Rice and committing other various acts of violence on patrol against many innocent civilians, there's also another really important job that is going neglected, and that is investigating and preparing cases for prosecution of really serious crimes committed against people, and I want to focus specifically on crimes committed against women of color. As you heard, one of my areas of specialization is sexual offenses. We know that only about 3% of all perpetrators of sexual offenses get punished by our judicial system. Homicide, we do a little bit better there. Police solve about 50% of all homicides, but that also means that half of them are going unsolved. Cases are not being built for prosecution, and cases are not being brought, perpetrators are not being held accountable and brought to justice. And so serious crimes against women of color are basically the other side of the coin of police use of force against communities of color. Women of color experience some of these very serious crimes, including sexual assault, domestic violence, and homicide at disproportionately high rates. Women of color, black women in particular, make up 40% of all female homicides in this country. And yet these women are often ignored as victims and treated by law enforcement and prosecutors in ways that are inhumane and can even be despicable. And so the focus on police brutality leads to a neglect of these other really important crimes and results in a tremendous miscarriage of justice and a system-based enabling and endorsing of crimes against women of color. So I want to first talk about a few cases that show and illustrate what I'm talking about, and I'm picking 3 examples. It's so hard to pick examples because there's so many. So I'm just going to limit myself to 3, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of solutions that could be helpful here. So I want to talk by focusing first on a couple of serial murder cases and the case of a serial rapist. And what we see in these cases are 2 clear patterns that emerge. First, that where women of color are concerned, where it's women of color as victims, police often ignore victims and their families. When they complain of crime, they simply don't investigate. They act like it's not a big deal. And on top of that, perpetrators know that police will ignore certain types of victimization, and they act accordingly. And so let's look at the case of Samuel Little first. Samuel Little is a serial murderer who actually passed away. I think it was just recently in 2020. In 2019, the FBI declared Samuel Little to be the most prolific serial killer in United States history. He had a pattern of offending that included traveling across the entire country and raping and murdering women for 35 years, from 1970 until 2005. According to the FBI, Little confessed to having committed, late in life, he got around to confessing. He confessed to having committed 93 murders. At least 50 of those have been verified by law enforcement officers, so they haven't all been. And at least 3 of those murders occurred in Cleveland. But they occurred all over the country because he traveled a lot murdering women. He was not apprehended until 2014, and he was convicted at that time in relation to 3 of those murders, and then died in prison in 2020. Ultimately, I think he was actually convicted of 8 murders before his death, but again, he's linked to at least 50, and he confessed to 93. So we might ask, how does a man get away with murdering dozens and dozens of women over 35 years? Well, Samuel Little himself told us how he got away with it. He said he did it by staying in the ghetto. So speaking with a female journalist in 2018, Little stated, "I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists. Nothing like that. If I killed you, it'd be all over the news the next day. I stayed in the ghettos." So his words showed an awareness that police would ignore his crimes if he stuck to vulnerable women of color. And he did. He murdered women only. He murdered primarily women of color, many of whom had other vulnerabilities, including mental health issues, socioeconomic status issues, drug use, and things of that nature, family estrangement, and so forth. Now, law enforcement are also aware that there's a nexus between race, gender, vulnerability, and being a murder victim, and that nexus is no accident. And so former police chief and president of the National Police Foundation, Jim Boerman, commenting on the Little case, said, "One of the unfortunate realities of policing is that departments that are under pressure to solve a variety of murders may pay less attention to victims from a more vulnerable population if they don't have the same organized community pressure to solve those crimes. If a killer wants to do as many murders as possible, they'll start to exploit those gaps in the social fabric and those weaknesses in law enforcement and victims that few people care about." And personally, in my opinion, I would tweak that to say people in positions of power maybe don't care about these victims. Certainly their families, their communities care deeply about these victims. Crime analysts with the FBI about Samuel Little stated, for many years, Samuel Little believed he would not be caught because he thought no one was accounting for his victims. Now, other serial offenders have targeted women of color for the exact same reason. evading detection for many years because they thought their victims would not be looked at with concern because police, people in positions of power don't care about black women who are victims of crime. So the other murder example I'll give is Anthony Sowell right here in Cleveland. I'm sure all Clevelanders know about him. Anthony Sowell raped and murdered 11 African-American women whose bodies were found in his home in 2011. He murdered these women one after the other over 2 to 3 years in 2008 and 2009 without police noticing what was going on. Despite the fact that he was a registered sex offender, had spent 15 years in prison, they were supposed to be checking up on him. Despite the fact that there were victims who got away from Anthony Sowell and went to the police for help, including one panicked woman who escaped nude by jumping out of a second-story window at his house, flagging down a police car. They ignored family members who went to police and filed missing persons report and said, you know, my niece, she's gone. And one of those women was told, Sandy Drain, went to the police about her missing niece, Gloria Walker, was told, oh, well, she's a drug user. She'll come back when the drugs run out. They also ignored a horrific stench that was coming from Sowell's home and which was noticed by many people in the community, including a sausage factory, which was located right next door to Sowell's home, and which ran extensive checks to make sure that they were not responsible for the stench. So how can a police department be more blind to violence being committed against women of color than to ignore all of these different warning signs that they had here in this situation? And so Little's case was horrific because of the massive number of victims that he accumulated. Sowell's case egregious because he did it in plain view, right at his home, without even burying the bodies and with police not noticing the evidence right in front of their eyes and their ears and their noses. Just quickly, Daniel Hotzclaw, we see the same dynamic. Hotzclaw was an Oklahoma City police officer who was sentenced to prison finally for 263 years for assaults on 13 African-American women during unnecessary traffic stops. Prosecutors said that for 6 months in 2013-2014, Hotzclaw targeted women he stopped while out on patrol, singling out poor black women victims with minor criminal backgrounds, like minor arrest warrants, something like that, thinking that those stories would not be believed. And quoting a prosecutor here, he didn't choose CEOs or soccer moms. He chose women he could count on to not tell what he was doing. He counted on the fact that no one would believe them, no one would care. Like many other serial perpetrators of crimes against women, Hotzclaw became emboldened when he had so much success and wasn't caught, such that one day he stopped a middle-aged African-American woman who had no criminal history, and she actually called the police after being sexually assaulted by him. That initiated an investigation, and they found all of these other victims. And so those are 3 examples of perpetrators targeting women of color because they specifically know police aren't going to care about these crimes, they're not going to investigate them, and so these men can get away with it. I just want to mention a couple other quick factors that I've also seen in some of these cases. I'm happy to talk more about them in the Q&A because you can imagine I have loads of cases I could talk about. We also see patterns where police will sometimes not follow the ordinary protocols that should be used in investigations, so they'll make exceptions when the victim is a black woman and not do what they're supposed to do. They will show callousness towards victims, not treating them with dignity, not respecting their humanity, and they will turn on victims to protect a defendant who was privileged by race or socioeconomic status or other factors and turn on the victim instead. So those are some of the patterns we see in terms of this under-enforcement. So bottom line is there's a massive job that police are not doing, and this job is not as easy as pulling out a gun and shooting somebody in the back while they run away. This is a job that takes training, it takes experience, it takes resources, it takes commitment and accountability. So we have a job here that police aren't doing, and they need the tools to do it, and they need to be held accountable for doing that. So solutions. There's one particular solution I want to spend most of my remaining time talking about. And it comes out of an example we see in Illinois that could be adapted to a broader purpose, as I'll talk about. So Illinois, in the last couple years, has passed a law called the Illinois Sexual Assault Incident Procedure Act. And this is a law that's a very special law that could be used as a springboard for further reform. So what is it? This law requires certain procedures to be followed in Illinois in relation to every single report of sexual assault, eliminating the opportunity to ignore crimes based on the race or gender or any other vulnerable characteristic of the victim. The reason that this act was passed was that there was a group of prosecutors and a female attorney general, Lisa Madigan, who at the time really cared about doing something about sexual assault. They were concerned that sexual assault was an extremely serious and yet underreported and under-prosecuted crime, and that changes to police procedures were needed in order to improve the law enforcement response to sexual assault. The state was concerned that sexual assault disproportionately impacts women, children, LGBTQ individuals, women of color, and yet rarely results in a conviction. They were also concerned with the trauma involved in sexual assault and officers needing to know how to constructively deal with that trauma so that they could do a more effective job interviewing victims. And so that's where this law came from. And so what does this law require? This law sets out a statewide response to sexual assault that must be followed by law enforcement agencies. They all have to have policies on investigating sexual assault specifically that meet certain standards that are set by the state. And you can find model policies on the Illinois website that can be downloaded by any specific department. Now, they will all have done that by now because there was a deadline for compliance. That deadline has passed, so all departments now have to have these policies in place. They have to provide robust training in sexual assault investigation practices, particularly using a trauma-informed approach so that they can do a better job with victims. And the law also includes detailed provisions on sexual assault evidence collection kits, more colloquially known as rape kits, and how quickly they must be processed. Here in Cleveland, everybody knows, I think, about what a big deal rape kits are and how if they sit on shelves, they're completely meaningless. So Illinois has established a tracking system that allows workers and victims to track the progress on each kit from collection to the laboratory to reporting the results to the police and to the victim. So I'm just going to touch on a few highlights of what this law does. Written reports. There's a requirement that every single report of sexual assault has to be memorialized in a written report. And one provision of the law says no law enforcement agency may refuse to complete a written report as required by this section on any ground. And so one of the issues is jurisdiction. In Illinois, if somebody reports to the wrong jurisdiction, the department cannot say, oh, you need to go down the road to this other police department. They are required to take the report there. They are required to take a written report. They are required to send it to the correct jurisdiction within a certain amount of time, and they have to provide transportation to the victim if needed, as I'll set out in a moment. There are provisions as well in the Act that empower victims with information that equips them to follow up with the police. And all of these things are a way of empowering the victims to actually participate in the process and help make sure that the police are held accountable. So when a victim comes in to report a sexual assault, she has to be notified on the front end first of the time frame that she has to get a rape kit. Some people might think, I went home and I showered, there's no point in getting a rape kit. Victims have to be told, you actually have 7 days to go to the hospital and get a rape kit done. The sooner you go, the better the evidence will be, but they can do it for up to 7 days. They have to be told that. Victims have to be told they will not be charged for hospital emergency services or for forensic medical services after sexual assault. They have to be told that the forensic evidence collected in the rape kit will not be used to prosecute the victim for any offense regarding alcohol, cannabis, or any controlled substance. They have to be told about civil remedies they have in Illinois, the civil no contact order. They have to be provided with information about that, and they have to be provided with a referral to an agency that can help them file for a civil no contact order. They also have to be provided with transportation to a hospital for forensic services or for emergency care. They need to be provided with transportation to the nearest available judge to get a civil no contact order, and they have to be provided with evidence about the sexual assault tracking, the rape kit tracking system, so that they can get their name and their password and they can log into that system and they can follow up and see where their rape kit is. They are also told that they have 10 years from the date of the assault to make a decision about whether or not they want that kit to be tested and whether they want to participate in a prosecution. So why this law matters? This law was specifically designed to ensure that serious crimes committed against marginalized people are taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. And there are a number of provisions I've laid out that make it easy for the victim to know what their rights are and to participate in that process. A corollary to this law, that's, as far as I know, this law is only available right now in Illinois. No other states have passed it as far as I know. This law, though, I think it should be passed in all states, but it can also be adapted to be used with other serious crimes. So going back to Anthony Sowell for a moment, suppose we had a law like this and it also covered not just sexual assault, which would be a huge amount of what we need to deal with, but if it also covered disappearing persons, if it also covered homicide, then when Sandy Drain went in, she went to 3 different police stations to report that her niece was missing. None of them would take a report in the Anthony Sowell case. Under a law like this, the first station she went to would be required to take a missing persons report. They would give her a way to follow up. They would be required to thoroughly investigate that missing persons report. So I think that a law like this can actually go a long way to make sure police are focusing on the job that they need to do, that we all need them to do, and that they're equipped with the tools and the resources to do that job. And then I'll just wrap up by saying, in addition to a law like the one Illinois has, many communities are now using a sexual assault response team approach to provide survivors with a coordinated community-wide response to sexual assault. And these teams are comprised of police officers as well as victim advocates, SANE nurses, prosecutors, social workers, and others. And this team approach to sexual assault is a way of holding police accountable for making sure they do their job, because all these other agencies and community members know what that job is and will hold them to task so that you don't have somebody not doing that job. We, again, can use that same kind of approach, and what Mr. Jackson was talking about with the changes here in Cleveland, I think are kind of similar, that the idea here is we need more transparency and accountability with police. It can't just be police supervising themselves, but we need community mechanisms for making sure police are carrying out the duties and responsibilities that we actually need to have them do. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much.
Distinguished co-panelists, and I'm excited to talk to you about the work that Professor Clark and Professor Cummings and Caleb Conrad and I have been working on, that really focus on what we see as a thread that runs through what we are seeing in terms of police violence that particularly targets communities of color. We are very interested in looking at how our criminal justice system is actually at the epicenter of a public health crisis. And so we want to talk, and we're bringing a public health lens to this and examining how we have some self-perpetuating cycles that are happening that intersect with our criminal justice system and with policing in particular. The medical and health community have known for a number of years that when people come in with chronic and daunting health issues, that they can write a prescription and still cannot cure the people who are coming in. And in fact, it is well known among the medical and healthcare community in general that more than 30% of health outcomes actually rely on things that are completely and totally outside of healthcare providers' control. These things are known as social determinants of health. And our work focuses in particular on a subset of those social determinants of health, where we are looking at adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are traumatic events that occur during childhood, that is before the age of 18, and are often, they're the subset, of course, of social determinants of health, which, more broadly is the conditions where people work and live and grow and age. And these kinds of things can include economic opportunities, education, housing, work conditions, food security, and those kinds of things. But ACEs, adverse childhood experiences in and of themselves, are generally going to be in 7 to 10 different categories of adversities that may include verbal or emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, living with someone who abuses alcohol or drugs, parental separation or divorce, having a mother who is treated violently. I think the remarks that Professor Avalos made immediately prior to this about gender violence, and that is one of the things when that's happening in a home is one of these adverse childhood experiences for the children who witness that. The incarceration or death of a member of the household, living with someone who was mentally ill or depressed, and then some of these, broader social disadvantage, economic hardship, housing instability, things like that. And the research is very clear that the more adverse childhood experiences a person encounters before the age of 18, the more negative health outcomes that person will experience as an adult. Quite literally, adverse childhood experiences take years off of a person's life. For someone who has 6 or more ACEs, they are likely to die 20 years earlier than someone who experiences no adverse childhood experiences at all. And we're not just talking about experiences that then make people likely to engage in self-destructive behaviors that are going to result in negative outcomes. I mean, clearly the research does support that people who experience childhood trauma are going to be more likely to have substance abuse disorders, are more likely to experience obesity, to do some other things where there may be some behaviors that result that are self-harm, but there are also a number of health outcomes that are just completely unrelated, that, where someone's more likely to develop cancer, 3 or 4 times more likely to develop cancer. And these are very compelling findings that we think are very important from the standpoint of informing how our criminal justice system and how policing in particular are part of that cycle that can reproduce that trauma for families and particularly for communities of color. And just real briefly before we move on to the other panelists who are going to further expound on this, I want to share, I'm going to do a quick screen share here, and I hope, it's been disabled, I don't know. Eric, is somebody able to help me out here with being able to screen share? I didn't realize it was going to be disabled. All right. So what I'm going to share here, this is the questionnaire that it's generally accepted as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Screening Tool. And it's got some limitations, but there are 10 questions, and I'm going to kind of scroll through these. And I, want to say at the outset, I mean, many people have experienced these kinds of traumas, and these are, if this is something that you've experienced, it may be difficult to think about. And so I just want to warn you on the front end that these are some difficult things to reflect on. But we have, 12.5% or so of people who have 4 or more of these. So these are things that are very common. The original research study that was done on these in the mid-90s was really a, pretty wealthy, largely white, pretty affluent community. And the prevalence of ACEs, even in this community certainly suggested a pretty broad applicability of the findings of this study. So I want to run through just real quick what these ACEs are. And again, these are what happened before your 18th birthday. And I'm not going to read these for you. I'm just going to allow you to take a minute to look at them. As you think about these two, know too that for every ACE that you have, there is what's called a dose-response effect. So the more of these you experience, there's a multiplier effect to the negative impact that this experience had on you. The survey not take into account what's coming to be known in the literature as protective factors. This is just looking at the adverse experiences, but the research is also showing that there are factors that can hedge against the negative impact of these adverse childhood experiences. And I think as we think through policing in particular, there are some recommendations that we hope come out of our research that serve as those sort of ameliorating factors. It struck me the very first time that I saw this survey, how many of these do in fact intersect with the justice system. And even I think in my own document, even though as a judge I'm not handling criminal justice issues, I'm doing involuntary commitments for people who have serious mental illness. I'm handling domestic orders of protection for victims of gender violence. And I'm seeing a lot of folks who are coming through who have the need for guardianship because their parents are in prison. So these are the 10 primary adverse childhood experiences that have been shown to have a material adverse impact on health outcomes for people as they move into adulthood. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn things on over to my next co-panelist, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we threaded this work through our look at policing and on particularly on racial disparities. I think that it's really important that there is a clear link to racial disparities in health in all of this. And so at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over. I believe, Caleb, are you up next?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Judge Johnson.
But Judge Johnson and Caleb, before you jump in, I do want to say something that was just really quickly, and what you guys will find out about our group, myself, Professor Cummings, Caleb, and Judge Johnson, we will jump in on each other's presentation, but Judge Johnson made a very compelling point about the individuals that experience 6 or more ACEs compared to individuals that have no ACEs. And the research from this Kaiser-Permanente study suggested that those individuals lived 20 less years. The thing that I thought was that we thought as a group that was very, very compelling about that is that study was conducted between 1995 and 1997. Approximately 17,000 people were interviewed, and out of that 17,000 that were interviewed, 75% of the people that were participated in that study were white. There were about 5% Latino and 5% African American, and this is the kicker. 75% of the people out of that attended college. So we're not talking about the people in underserved communities. We don't even know. I don't even know what the numbers would look like if we actually did an evaluation of ACEs on underserved communities. It might be more than 20 years. You might be talking about 40 years, right? So I think it's so important to sort of highlight that perspective, because these are the numbers among sort of the haves, not the have-nots. And one of the things you have to keep in mind about the fact when we're talking about the haves, even if they encounter those situations, have resources and access to resources that can step in and provide interventions in order to sort of right the ship, in order to give those individuals additional life expectancy, which we don't see in minority communities that often consist of African Americans or Latinos. So I think that's a really, really important point. And Judge Johnson, I'm sorry for jumping in.
No,
I think you guys have 10 minutes
so
left.
important, I think, to just when you look too at the two numbers that most determine someone's life expectancy is their zip code and their credit score, and I think that tells a lot about in particular how disadvantaged some communities are, and really I think how these adverse childhood experiences can concentrate in communities that don't have the resources to hedge against that. So sorry, Caleb, it's your turn now.
Social disadvantage is a category of ACE that seeks to wrap into one group trauma produced by economic hardship, community violence, discrimination, and historical trauma. And two of the leading factors working to increase the likelihood of traumatic experiences for children is poverty and racial discrimination. After all, a child whose home life is defined by consistent hunger, significant violence, and racial oppression experiences never-ending feelings of heightened fear and terror, and this leads to toxic stress. Toxic stress has been found to be one of the answers as to why childhood trauma impacts long-term health. It's unhealthy when our fight or flight sense is a normal, right? It's supposed to keep us safe. Nadine Burke-Harris likens it to seeing a bear on a hike. That stress response may save you in that situation. However, toxic stress happens when you live with the bear. And Black children experience much higher levels of toxic stress in the United States because they are Black. Being Black in America means that you live with the bear. And it's no surprise that a majority of Black children experience an ACE, at least 61%. It's also found that Black children are at least 45% more likely than white children to have experienced one traumatic experience, 29% more likely to have been exposed to two, and 21% more likely to have experienced three or more. Black children are then left to deal with the aftermath of the negative effects of trauma, and this includes their behavioral and health outcomes. This forces us to confront an ugly intersection between poverty and race. And my co-authors and I believe the research shows that Black children experience trauma because it is traumatic to be raised Black in America. And oppression and racial discrimination are not sometimes experiences, they're pervasive. They infiltrate nearly every aspect of a Black child's life, from his home environment to his school's disciplinary system to his nutritional diet and his relationship with caregivers. Black children spend less time learning about the world around them and more time struggling to survive within it. And therein lies the ultimate problem. It must be acknowledged that for decades and for generations, Black children have been forced to grow up in communities where traumatic experiences are often considered normal, and where ACEs are not things to be protected or avoided against, but instead mark a day in the life of Black America. Activist Kayron Valentine likens low-income neighborhoods and inner-city communities to a literal war zone. This is what he writes. For these kids, the war zone encompasses a place they call home. And home is a place where many of them are taught to strive to make it out before it kills them. For these young residents, the response is not post-traumatic because they continue to experience traumatic events every day. Low-income neighborhoods often lack adequate social and municipal services, possess higher crime rates, and are unable to provide opportunities for children to explore, socialize, and grow, not to mention how many families in these communities have been torn apart due to America's fascination with mass incarceration. Urban poverty passes from generation to generation. In his book, Stuck in Place, Patrick Sharkey wrote, he found that 70% of Black Americans living in the nation's poorest neighborhoods today are from families who lived in those same communities in the 1960s. His conclusion is simple. He said, the American ghetto appears to be inherited. We know it's no accident that neighborhoods of concentrated poverty are disproportionately Black. In The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein details that such residential racial segregation is the direct result of a history of deliberate federal, state, and local practices. This state-sanctioned residential racial discrimination dilutes for any protective factors against ACEs in these communities. In our previous work, my co-authors and I have argued that the criminal justice system should constitute an additional adverse childhood experience for Black children in this country. From the hyper-policing of Black people and Black communities to the racist charging decisions of prosecutors and what's called the invisible mass incarceration, which is the broken system of probation and parole. Our current system fosters further needless mass incarceration, continued police violence against unarmed Black people, and a criminal justice system that is not equitable and in fact is overtly traumatic and oppressive. To explain how our paper will build on that premise, I'm going to turn it over to Dre.
So Professor Clark and I are going to share our final few minutes talking about our current project. On behalf of the team, though, I have to say how grateful we are to Aisha Bell Hardaway and Brian Adamson for putting this together, to Merritt and her case law review team for hosting this event. Our work, as described, focuses on childhood trauma and how American policing adds undeniable trauma onto the lives of Black and brown children. But I want to be clear here. It's not just trauma. Police kill Black children. Tamir Rice was 12 when he was killed. Police kill Latinx children. Adam Toledo was 13 when he was killed. So what our project plans to do now is extend our work on childhood trauma to trauma experienced by Black law enforcement officers. We believe, and we will endeavor to look at how traumas impact Black police officers as children and how trauma impacts Black police officers as adults. Because it is our deep belief that Black police officers experience discrimination and trauma as children in exorbitant rates as described by Caleb, but also as they experience policing. Today, our keynote speaker, Carol Horn, described entering the Buffalo police force as foreign and feeling as if she could not change the way that Black Americans were treated by the police as the enemy. And so we will instrumentalize this research by interviewing Black police chiefs and longtime Black police officers who have risen through the ranks to retirement. We will talk to them and interview them about the traumas they experienced as children. We will interview and talk to them about the traumas they experienced as adults and how these traumas impacted their ability to police their communities. Professor Clark's going to take us home by describing how we plan to move our project forward.
So thank you for that introduction and sort of background, Professor Cummings, Caleb, and Judge Johnson. It's always a pleasure when I have an opportunity to work with them and to present with them. And again, we're very thankful of this opportunity to speak. But just to sort of transition in terms of where we're going to take this piece, we're actually thinking about this work in a sort of a series of works. One of the things that Professor Cummings mentioned in terms of doing the interviews with the police officers, we think that's really important to sort of get their own anecdotal observations because that tells a story, right? It gives us a narrative through which we can extrapolate certain things about trauma and the way that it has been observed in the context of law enforcement. But one of the things we also want to do is we want to make a concerted effort to do more data analysis in this area. When we were having this discussion about the data analysis, one of the things we did as a group, we have these wonderful, robust sessions, and we were talking about just diving into the data. And one of the things we recognize is that there are a lot of sort of procedural challenges, IRB approval, as well as just in terms of getting people to participate. Judge Johnson had sent us this wonderful article about a researcher that tried to do something very similar to what we did, and this particular researcher ran into a lot of roadblocks, right? And one of the things is that he said he put together this study, and he said, I failed to put together the study. And so we were like, we had some ideas about why that might be. He talked about them a little bit. We could probably anticipate, as I'm sure you can anticipate, some of the reasons why it failed. One, there was ability to identify participants because of low turnout. So there was a fear that if people didn't participate in a meaningful capacity, that it would be easier for people to identify who the actual participants were in the study. So that created a problem. There was a second problem, which was that in the event that you have this discussion about mental health and Black officers are experiencing trauma and the agency isn't doing what it needs to do in order to adequately protect those officers or put them in sort of better situations to deal with those types of issues, that the organization will be stigmatized. So to avoid having the organization stigmatized, the organization doesn't participate to avoid getting data that can be used as a stick against it. The other thing is that there was also individualized fear from the actual participants that might participate in the survey. If their managers or their superiors or if their coworkers found out that they were suffering from mental harm, how would they be evaluated in the workplace? And so there were some fears there. And so one of the things that we want to do is the reason we want to focus on the interviews is because we want to develop relationships. And in our first piece, we really want to talk about we are not creating an environment where we're trying to penalize law enforcement or institutions that provide those services. What we want to do is engage in a process to help them develop better processes for policing, as well as for providing a safe space for the people that are providing the policing, because we believe that that will ensure and allow for more responsible policing of minority communities. And so part of it is sort of dispelling this myth that we are trying to attack you, and instead of thinking about this as we are trying to work with you. So our first piece is going to be set up to say, hey, this is not, your problem, this is our problem. Let's work together. And we're hopeful that we will be able to establish key relationships with stakeholders that have the ability to allow us to get this data. So we're in the process of going through IRB approval in order to begin to conduct the data analysis that will ultimately be a component of a future article. And so I'll stop there without taking up too much time and to give you guys an opportunity to ask everyone questions. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, can you hear me? I am unique in the sense that I am a professor of criminal justice at Youngstown State University, and we've been talking today about law enforcement and policing, and beginning on Monday, I am going back to Youngstown to train future undergraduate students who are going into law enforcement. So I think it's important to study some of the topics that we've touched on today regarding police training, whether that's appropriate, how much is appropriate. I'm going to talk about a number of things. I'm going to talk about use of force. I'm going to talk about the demographic variables in use of force and some of the research that has been done, which leads to accountability, which are some of the things that we want to focus on, and then potential change, what we can do. So when we think about use of force, one of the things that I was frantically writing is some of the other speakers were talking is about police training, and that's been a big thing in undergraduate school, because in Ohio you do not need a college degree to be a law enforcement officer. You need 15 weeks, and that is it. At Youngstown State University, where I teach, down the hall from me is the Police Academy, one of many in Ohio, and they can go 8 hours a day for 15 weeks, pass the OPAR exam, and be done. And in some professions, you need a lot more than 15 weeks. So that's the training that is required in the state of Ohio. Now, having taught future police officers, sometimes that can be a scary thing, because one of the things that was brought up earlier is whether or not those young students are prepared to handle a gun. Are they prepared to use force when they have to? Is their motivation? One of the articles I wrote about in the book chapter was the ethical use of police force. What is the motivation that is driving these very young undergraduate students to want to be a police officer, number one? Why do they want to be a police officer? And I will share a personal story with you. I had a student in my criminology class who I asked, why do you want to be a police officer? And he said, can I be honest with you, Dr. Bayless? He said, I want a gun. And that man is now a police officer, getting into it for the wrong reasons. And I don't want to say that happens a lot, because there are students that want to get into it for the right reasons. But when you talked about psychological training and needing to really see what is behind some of these young individuals who want to go into law enforcement, so they don't end up in some of the sad cases we've seen in the Youngstown-Warren area, which is where I'm from, obviously. We've had a lot of Department of Justice investigations locally regarding police use of force, and hopefully they're trying to get those resolved. Now, the research shows that use of force is rare. From 2002 to 2011, 44 million U.S. citizens had face-to-face contact with police, but only about 1.2% were considered excessive. So we have use of force, obviously, and then we take it one step further to excessive use of force. So as some of the officers in the room know, the Department of Justice has a continuum on use of force, everything from verbal commands to, unfortunately, drawing your weapon. And then we have excessive use of force, and we look to see what has been considered or not considered reasonable, and that can be subjective or objective depending on who you ask. One of the research things that I looked at with this that ties with my other research regarding demographic variables is research I've done on juries. This also gets to one of the presenters who talked about the race and gender of victims in crimes. So my preliminary research revolved death penalty, as he mentioned before, and that had centered on the issue of race as well, race of the victim. Does race of the victim matter in whether jurors sentence somebody to die? And there was a 1992 study, the very famous Bayless study in capital punishment, that said it does. If you are African American and the homicide and all the factors surrounding the homicide are identical, you are 4.3 times more likely to get the death penalty. And that was cited by a number of court cases in many opinions as the famous Bayless study regarding capital punishment. So that kind of introduced me a lot to different demographic factors and how they impact capital punishment, which is obviously the ultimate punishment. Also, demographics play a factor in how we perceive victims of crime. I know this because I interviewed real jurors in those cases. And depending on the status of the individual on trial and the victim, it matters to jurors. They told me it matters. They told me they are more likely to sentence a person to die if they kill a police officer as opposed to if they kill an unworthy victim. And by unworthy victim, this is kind of, I think, what you were alluding to before. The status of the victim. We know from studying media and crime that definitely plays a huge role, those demographics, in how we look at crime victims and homicide. I don't know if you remember the Natalie Holloway case several years ago. It was non-stop coverage. What has the social science research showed us with respect to victims? That if you are a young, blonde, attractive female, you will get more media coverage than anyone else. Those cases in which it is a minority victim, and some of the research is going to show it that I'm going to present, not so much. It's not going to be on every, and pretty much that's just a ratings media-driven viewership standard. So I went ahead and I looked at some of the research that kind of merges the two. How do jurors look at use of force cases when they do get that far? What do jurors think? So the first study that I want to bring to your attention is one in 2018, and it was mock juror perceptions of police shootings. And the findings, this is by Huff, Alvarez, and Miller, jurors do not fully understand police procedure, admittedly. Jurors are more concerned with whether the defendant is guilty. They revolve their thoughts more around that than any faulty police practices that are brought to their attention. Huff found, and he wanted to study what was called the bandwagon effect. Bandwagon effect is strong public attitudes towards a topic result in more strongly held individual attitudes, hopping on the bandwagon, right? So they were given in this study, now again, I'm a social science person, so obviously these are mock jurors, were given scenarios in which they looked at justifiable and unjustifiable use of force. They defined unjustified as where the police officer was unsure if the victim would use force, and justified if the victim was going to use force. What did the study show? The study showed that a police officer was more likely to be convicted when there was an unjustified shooting of an African American victim. Jurors paid, now this is contrary to what they thought, jurors paid more attention to a case when the victim was African American. So the bottom line of the study was mock jurors, again, expressed bias for African American victims and were more certain of their verdict. Why did the authors think that came about? The bandwagon effect, because this was done right after Black Lives Matter movement came to the forefront and all of the media attention given to these different cases. There was another study done that I wanted to share with you, just done in 2022 by Pika and others. It was called Guns, Gloves, and Tasers: Perceptions of Police Officers and Their Use of Weapons as a Function of Race and Gender. I won't go through the boring statistics, but what they did was they varied the race and gender of the police officers in these studies, and they presented them to, again, a set of mock jurors. What they found was mock jurors are more likely to vote the officer guilty when he was a white male and used a gun and when the victim was white. That was the highest scenario. The officer was seen as more favorably when he was an African American and did not use a gun. And then they did something else. They also took into account whether the police officer used force when they were either on duty or off duty. That definitely mattered. When the police officer used force when they were off duty was, of course, seen less favorable. And the weapon used also played a factor. Police officers were found more guilty when they used a gun than when they used anything else. And I think in the study it was a taser or a glove or something like that, because the idea behind it was that the officer had already had bad intentions with that gun, already had plans to kill with that gun. And when it was a taser or something else, that perhaps they were a little bit more able to give benefit of the doubt. The other study that I wanted to share with you was also hot off the press, was by Sturgis, Flick, and others. And they did something that I thought was interesting. They looked at civil jury compensation and judgment of police use of force at the intersection of race and mental health, which I thought ties into the previous topic. Basically, they were interested in studying how civil juries may award compensation to families of victims in use of force cases based on race and mental illness. And so they devised, and again, there are flaws with the methodology in many of these studies. They're mock jurors, they're not real jurors. These are scenarios that they are given. But they did come up with a wrongful death case where the family sought $10 million. These were vignettes, and they just varied certain things. They found that mock jurors were found the defendant not liable if the person that they killed had a mental illness, and specifically in this example they used schizophrenia. The idea behind that was the stigma that schizophrenia is somehow, obviously they must have been violent, of course he used force. The number one factor that a lot of these variables also looked at as a mediating variable was the way people viewed the police, which is not surprising. So they call that police legitimacy. It had even an impact on the award amount that mock jurors would give. So if they had strong police attitudes, strong favorability, that meant less money for victims. And then the bottom line, I think it's just when the victim of a use of force case was African American, mock jurors awarded less punitive damages as their attitudes towards police became more favorable, as opposed to when the victim was white. So those are just the more recent studies that regarding jury decision making, and I think it's important because they're community members, right? That's where we get them from, and they are influenced by public perception and the way that we are viewing these. what should we do to change this? I mean, is there any hope? What might the recommendations be? I think there is. One of them, it was brought up about mental health. And I know that in Ohio, I'm part of a CIP training for police officers. I don't know if anybody has heard that. CIP is becoming more and more popular. It's crisis intervention training. Now, one of the recommendations is, when we've been talking about changes in organizational behavior, you have to get the police organization and the chiefs to want to send their officers. I went through the training. I am not a police officer, but I teach them. I wanted to know what CI training was all about, so I spent, now, here's the thing, it's 40 hours. I stayed for the whole 40 hours. What do they do? They do a fairly good job. They teach police officers about mental health resources. Not that they should become mental health professionals, but to be able to link and refer them to when they run into these type of situations. And as an observer in the back of the room, half of my students were there, which made me happy. That was because the Sheriff's Department in Trumbull County is a big proponent of it. There are other departments that say it's worthless. And I talked to many police officers that said, I have no intention, I could care less about education, and I could care less about CIP training. But at least that's one positive thing that we can do from an organizational point of view. And the other, from an individual point of view, is to kind of work with the people that we recruit to become police officers. I will tell you, locally where I live, they are telling me they are hiring, they can't get police officers anymore, at least in Youngstown. They don't pay very well. And they told me that they are willing to take just about anybody who applies. They've turned to me and said, Chris, I am hiring people I would never have hired 10 years ago. I can't get anybody. I can barely fill a class. And that's problematic because we are going to see more of these use of force cases if they're not properly trained. So hopefully, some of these recommendations will be useful. Always room for more. And I hope to study basically more of the jury behavior because I think it's important for accountability. And that's all I have.
Thank you all for your presentation.
Hi, you were talking about the stats for when police officers are abusive. The stat when you first started speaking.
Yeah.
Some of those abuses are not reported
Yes.
because sometimes they don't take the reports. So that's the point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Caleb, I need your notes.
I want to ask a question. Why would you wait until they become a police officer? Why check their mental status? Before, and then if they have a problem before they become a police officer, they won't be taken on the force.
Right. No,
Would that be discrimination if they did that?
potentially it could be. Now, I don't, it's not I could get into a lot of trouble if I start, unless I have some concrete evidence to be able to identify these. From a professor's point of view, unless I can identify that somebody is going to be harmful or cause harm, it's usually up to departments that do the screening for it. I don't know what every single police academy does, but if I don't see a sign, I can't go out and say, I know that you can't let this person into the police academy because I think he's going to be a danger. I better have something more. The university's going to come back on me because mom and dad called and want to know exactly why I am preventing their son or daughter from an education. I'm not saying you can't do it. I mean, if there is a mental health issue with any student on campus, there are procedures we have to follow, absolutely. But sometimes, you just got to pay particular attention to a few students and see if they really do warrant something further.
I think it's a good question. You also get into another ball of health, sort of another challenge. Like if you have a mental health disability or issue that's covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, then you add a whole nother layer to that. And I think most of the testing that police departments probably will conduct to determine whether or not somebody is a mental health risk or has a propensity to engage in violence, it's really speculative at that point. So I think that might be another challenge about making a determinative decision about whether or not someone can or cannot do the job at that level. So I don't think you're wrong. I think it is a good idea to think about that on the front end, but I definitely think it's a careful sort of balancing that you would have to conduct in order to make that type of decision.
It seems to me that pairing that with some sort of support or intervention or identifying folks that may need some additional, mental health support in order to be able to be effective. And, particularly because right now a lot of police departments are going to include some sort of, if somewhat cursory psychological evaluation as part of the application process to become a police officer. But if that can be paired with, some sort of structure that provides some supports to police officers who may have, in their previous life experienced challenges that could impact on their job performance, I think having those supports in place would be an important thing to be able to compare with that. So we're not just excluding people, but we're identifying people with more intensive support.
If I could just ask a question. So a couple of things. The first, I think I heard somebody say there's a quote, the American ghetto appears to be inherited. I would probably say the American government is used as the next iteration of concentration camps by the government. But, right, because I think that the notion that it's intended to be passed down as an inheritance, right, is obviously not exactly what's happening here. The other thing that I would love for somebody to speak to, and this is Cummings et al., is, I certainly understand how the need to make sure that negative racial employment experiences, right, are documented and understood for Black officers. I'm a little bit less comfortable with the notion that focusing on childhood trauma only for Black officers doesn't somehow feed into notions of white superiority, if you will, right, that say that there's something wrong with Black officers and therefore we're seeing those outcomes on the street. And I would love for you to speak into sort of your decision making to limit your research in this way, and if you've considered that notion.
I'm happy to take that first, and the team can jump in. Aisha, it generates from the fact that at least I and our team have been so deeply embedded in looking at childhood trauma as it impacts Black and brown youth, and the fact that when Professor Clark identified that this study was conducted in San Diego with 17,000, mostly white, mostly college-educated individuals, that had that study been conducted in Black and brown communities, the statistics would probably be much worse. It would probably be a much more stringent or a much more significant life expectancy drop than what it already is. And so what we started thinking about was with Black and brown children that suffer these traumas that choose to become police. And our thinking there was, and this comes from a John McWhorter quote and something that we talked about in one of our articles, which is that John McWhorter said, he's a conservative Black writer, and he said that he never understood the OJ verdict until he started traveling around the country talking to black people, and said almost every black person that I met has a story about being abused by the police. And that you know, one of our friends and co-authors, Donald Tibbs, talks about being 13 and having a revolver put to his head as a child by a white police officer. And that sort of led us into thinking that if so many African American and Latinx youth have traumas with police, why do they choose to become police? And our thinking is, my thinking at least, is that they want to be part of correcting a corrupt system, part of getting into a system that's corrupt. And yet, in getting into a corrupt system, a foreign system, as Carol talked about earlier today, then they receive additional traumas of, you know, being discriminated against and hated. We have a black police chief, first ever in Little Rock, and there have been campaigns, false campaigns against him of sexual misconduct and all sorts of other things. And so our thinking on that front is just sort of identifying and extrapolating whether or not, I think one of our conclusions might be, we haven't done the study yet, but we think that one of our conclusions might be that this sort of hopeful thought of getting into policing to affect change is impossible, which gets into my questions earlier of what do we do when the system's toxic and rotten and anti-black. So that was our thinking, or at least my thinking, in focusing on the traumatic experiences that black police chiefs and black retired officers may have faced as children with the police, what their intents were to become police officers, and whether they feel like these traumas enabled them to make the kinds of differences they wanted to get into when becoming police. And so that's where that's where my focus was in sort of moving and evolving the project forward. But I'm really curious to hear if my thinking is what Judge and Professor and Caleb are thinking.
I'll jump in. Aisha, I think that's a wonderful question. And you know, I'll tell you this is that I definitely you know, appreciate your concerns, because I think that all of us would share those concerns, because I'm always, you know, sort of mindful of sort of perpetuating a notion that sort of whiteness is inherently better than blackness, and I'm very careful about that. I will say this: when in the nature of our discussions, I would say that the primary emphasis is on sort of black police officers or minority police officers, but that in the context of the study and the evaluation that we would do, I didn't look at that as though we would only interview, or not, excuse me, that we would only survey African American or minority officers. And I think that my colleagues would probably agree that the survey would be submitted to all of the officers, because I think it's important to look at both minority and non-minority officers, so that you can get sort of really good comparisons in order to sort of extrapolate the data that we would need to extrapolate in the ideas and in the connections that we're able to see. So I would say that we would look at all groups, but that the reason that we are conducting the survey is because of a sensitivity to the issues that specifically impact minority officers. And really, when we began this discussion, it kind of grew out of, you know, Professor Cummings was doing a lot of work after the Black Lives Matter movement. He wrote, I don't know, probably like 10 articles in the past year or two just about that sort of that movement, and sort of the genesis of all of our discussion grew out of that. So we were very laser focused on African Americans, black officers. And so, you know, if we have kind of presented this ideology that we're only looking at black officers, I think that we might have maybe overstepped a bit in terms of stating that. But we are going to survey all groups, because that's important for us to get good data, so that we can really look at the population that we were most concerned about. And I'm gonna be quite honest with you, I think that we all have some sort of hypothesis, but part of this is like, we believe that we're gonna learn as this goes on. I mean, I think that, I think the researcher will tell you that, like, he couldn't even get the data, so he didn't even get a chance to engage in that learning experience. And so those are some of the things that we're really excited about the project, and we think that there could be a lot of value in it.
Thank you so much. I could have this conversation with all of you really for the rest of the day, but my bosses are telling me that we are over time.